Michael, tell us how do you see the visit of General Asim Munir, the Chief of Army Staff of Pakistan, to US?
That it has been quite a lengthy visit, not just in terms of him being in Washington, but also in the U.S. So we know that he was in New York recently to meet with the UN Secretary General, and it's been a long time since a Pakistani Army chief met with the UN Secretary General. Here in Washington, there's so much focus on so many other things, particularly two, major conflicts, as you know, the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, and Pakistan doesn't really figure in those conflicts. But indeed, the fact that you do have the Army chief, the most powerful political leader in Pakistan, in the U.S. It provides opportunities for the relationship. In theory, it provides opportunities to reset the relationship. I think that for me, the interesting thing is what does he want to talk about and what do the Americans want to talk about? Because I imagine that he'll want to talk about a number of things that the Americans don't really have much of an interest in discussing, such as Kashmir, for example, also the issue of India. The Army chief would want to bring up the allegations against India for this assassination, this reputed assassination plot, may try to push the U.S. to rethink its relations with India, which I don't think the U.S. is willing to do. But I think that if there's one core issue that the U.S. would really want to discuss, it would have to be the Afghan refugee policy, the mass expulsion of Afghans. So many Afghans waiting for special immigration visas to come to the U.S. I imagine that U.S. officials would want to get assurances from General Munir that those Afghans will not end up back in Afghanistan.
We are honored to have Michael Kugelman. Michael is an expert on South Asia. He is the South Asia Institute Director at the Wilson Center. He is a writer, political analyst, and an expert on foreign policy. So, Michael, thank you so much, and we are honored to have you on our show after a long while. Thank you for your time. So, Michael, tell us how do you see the visit of General Asim Munir, the Chief of Army Staff of Pakistan, to US?
Well, it's been an interesting visit. One reason why I say that is that it has been quite a lengthy visit, not just in terms of him being in Washington, but also in the U.S. So we know that he was in New York recently to meet with the UN Secretary General, and it's been a long time since a Pakistani Army chief met with the UN Secretary General. It comes at an interesting time. I think it comes at a time that's not conducive for U.S.-Pakistan relations, simply because here in Washington, there's so much focus on so many other things, particularly two major conflicts, as you know, the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. And Pakistan doesn't really figure in those conflicts in any type of big way. Obviously, not directly, but not indirectly either. So I think that it's just very difficult for Pakistan to get the attention of the administration right now. But indeed, the fact that you do have the army chief, the most powerful political leader in Pakistan, in the U.S., it provides opportunities for the relationship. In theory, it provides opportunities to reset the relationship. But I think that we need to keep our expectations in check. For me, one of the big storylines with this relationship is that ever since U.S. forces left Afghanistan, the two sides have really struggled to identify new anchors
Hmm.
for cooperation. That may be one of the goals of Munir's visit. But I think that there's a disconnect. I imagine that General Munir came to the U.S. wanting to try to get the U.S. to agree to deeper security cooperation, particularly counterterrorism cooperation. And yet, though that is something that the U.S. wants to talk to Pakistan about, there have been discussions and dialogues on counterterrorism concerns. The U.S. actually wants to reshape the relationship to focus more on non-security issues, including trade, investment, climate change cooperation. But with the economy what it is in Pakistan, it's not very realistic to make economics a new pillar for the relationship at this point in time. But one final point on his trip. I think that for me the interesting thing is what does he want to talk about and what do the Americans want to talk about? Because I imagine that he'll want to talk about a number of things that the Americans don't really have much of an interest in discussing, such as Kashmir, for example, also the issue of India, which I think that the army chief would want to bring up the allegations against India for this assassination, this reputed assassination plot, may try to push the U.S. to rethink its relations with India, which I don't think the U.S. is willing to do. But I think that if there's one core issue that the U.S. would really want to discuss with the army chief on this visit, it would have to be the Afghan refugee policy, the mass expulsion of Afghans, just because you have so many Afghans waiting for special immigration visas to come to the U.S. I imagine that U.S.
Mhm.
officials would want to get assurances from General Munir that those Afghans will not end up back in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and then Michael, there is another aspect of it. Pakistan is facing the series of attacks from TTP, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, from Afghanistan, based in Afghanistan, and there is a high resentment, and the relations with the Afghan Taliban have come to, I guess, bottom low between Pakistan and Afghan Taliban. There is a talk that Pakistan should go and do conduct a surgical strikes inside Afghanistan. So, do you think security and the relations with Afghanistan were on the agenda?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Afghanistan and the terrorism issue were definitely on the agenda. And most, if not all, of the meetings that General Munir has had and will have during his remaining days here. And indeed, I don't want to underplay this resurgence of terrorism in Pakistan. Indeed, it is very serious. So there have been conversations in recent months between the U.S. and Pakistan on counterterrorism cooperation, but not in terms of kinetic levels of cooperation, more in terms of discussions about how the U.S. can help Pakistan address terrorism in terms of strengthening its capacity to reduce the likelihood of it, building up its capacities in law enforcement and conducting investigations and that type of thing. The problem, I think, when it comes to this issue of scaling up counterterrorism cooperation is that the US and Pakistan have different views as to what constitutes the biggest terrorist threat. I mean, of course, Pakistan is concerned about the TTP. The US is not as concerned about TTP as it used to be, just because it appears that TTP does not really target Americans or American interests anymore. For the US, the main concern is Islamic State Khorasan. But this is where it gets interesting. If you look at the messaging coming from US officials in recent months, there's been a lot of acknowledgement that the Taliban in Afghanistan have actually been able to conduct operations that have degraded the capacities of ISK. And that suggests to me that there's not as much of an incentive from a U.S. perspective to partner with Pakistan on CT because A, they're not as concerned about the TTP issue, and B, the issue that they are concerned about, ISK, is something that the Taliban are actually helping out with, even if indirectly. But all that said, there's been ongoing debates and defense dialogues between the two countries over the last few years, and they talk about a number of things. But one of the consistent focus areas has been terrorism, and that'll continue to be the case. Just because at the end of the day, they both agree that you have significant terrorist threats emanating from Afghanistan.
So,
Michael,
yeah, go ahead.
there is another question that during this discussion, see, you guys are following what is going on in Pakistan nowadays, and from sitting here, the way I see it, the control of military is just really very significant now. Previously they do it from inside, but you can see it. So how you see it, how much US is concerned of this type of attitude by the military, and do you really believe that Secretary Blinken raised this point to General Asim Munir?
I mean, I think it's unlikely that the U.S. officials meeting with Munir would have wanted to talk about the domestic situation. I think if anyone would bring it up, it would be the army chief himself to sort of justify the need for the army to play a substantive role in order to help advance stabilization. And if he does make that type of argument, I don't see the U.S. pushing back just because it's not interested in discussing those types of issues. Now, look, to be very candid, and this is no secret, I would argue that U.S. policy in Pakistan has never prioritized democracy, civilian democracy, democracy promotion. These are stated goals, officially stated priorities by the U.S. government or the U.S. on the whole. And there have been examples over the years of the U.S. making efforts to strengthen civilian institutions and civilian democracy. Many in Pakistan would disagree, but the Kerry Lugar-Burma legislation was meant to strengthen civilian institutions with no conditions. So that's an example. But at the end of the day, the nature of the relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan, it's a very unusual relationship. It's a transactional relationship. And I think that the U.S. has tended to have relatively limited goals, most of them security focused, particularly during the years when the U.S. is involved in wars in Afghanistan. And I think that the conclusion of U.S. officials in the past and now is that when you need to engage on substantive levels with Pakistan, you need to talk to the generals. You need to talk to the army. And this is why you have so many senior U.S. civilian officials meeting with army chiefs. That's why. So it doesn't help advance democracy, and it certainly does not make it less likely that the Pakistani military would play less of a role in democratic institutions. But I think it's really a practical matter from a U.S. perspective. You want to get things done, you go to those that can get things done because they have that
Mm,
type of power
correct.
and influence. Now, final note on this is that you know, certainly U.S. officials are aware of, and I assume would acknowledge the significant levels of crackdowns on the opposition happening in Pakistan now, but it's just not something that is going to be a priority, a discussion point, especially for the security officials that Munir meets with, but also I think at the State Department. They want to look at other things. The issues we mentioned before, counterterrorism, the Afghan refugee issue, and other things, non-security issues as well, talking about how to create a better environment for more trade and investment and those types of issues.
Right. So, Michael, what do you think as the outcome of this meeting? What do we see anything different? Because Pakistan was somewhat irrelevant after US pulled out of Afghanistan. So, what has changed now, and what will change from this point onward after this meeting?
Right. So I wouldn't use the term irrelevant. I don't think the U.S. views Pakistan as irrelevant. It's definitely not a top 10 priority
Mm,
relationship. But, General Munir would not have been invited here if the U.S. thought that Pakistan was irrelevant. So, there is still some interest for sure in engaging with Pakistan, and given that it neighbors Afghanistan among other things, and the relationships it has with China and other key players like the Saudis and others, this is important for the U.S. But in terms of outcomes, I think we need to keep expectations low. I don't expect any major substantive outcomes. It's not like there's going to be a new arms deal or anything like that announced. Let's not forget that the U.S. has suspended U.S. security aid to Pakistan has been suspended since the early days of the Trump administration. I don't think there's an interest in changing that. Theoretically, if you're going to have new initiatives that relate to, trade deals or agreements to do more on climate change or education or whatever, it shouldn't be the army chief that's making those deals. Things are a bit different now because this current army chief is taking a particularly strong role in policy, even more than is usually the case, in part because of the dynamics in Pakistan and it being a caretaker government. But so theoretically, he's not emboldened or he's not empowered to be privy to these new deals on issues beyond security issues. So, if anything, maybe there'd be a new commitment to step up cooperation to some degree on counterterrorism. But I wouldn't really look at that. Now,
eh,
as you all know, but in Pakistan, there's always going to be a lot of speculation, conspiracy theories about what's really happening in these discussions, and so many might think that the army chief is going to be looking for assurances from the Americans that they're not going to push back if the election is delayed, for example, or something like that. Again, I don't think those are the types of things the U.S. has any interest in discussing, and I don't really think that we're going to be talking about secret deals or anything like that. I just think that here actually I'll end here. Here's one thing that we could perhaps expect. It's not a very sexy deliverable or anything like that, but one of the big advantages or the successes of U.S.-Pakistan relations over the years has been officer to officer relations. The militaries, they've been at each other's throats in some degrees just because of the
mhm,
history of the military supporting terrorists that threaten the U.S. and all that. But because you have this long legacy of military training programs and exchanges, you have Pakistani officers spending time at U.S. training academies. Until fairly recently, you had American military officers spending time at Pakistani military academies. You actually have a fair amount of goodwill and camaraderie between officers on both sides. So
right,
maybe there'll be
right.
some announcement of new commitments for training exchanges, not in terms of military training, but educational training, something
Mhm.
like that.
Right. And how
Climate.
about on the economic side?
Again, I think that the U.S. is hesitant to agree to new economic arrangements with Pakistan so long as the economy continues to be struggling as it is. Of course, it has stabilized a bit with the new IMF package and so on. I do think that this is the place to look as we try to gauge the relationship down the road. You hear the U.S. ambassador in Pakistan in almost every one of his public comments talking about his desire to strengthen trade and investment. But I just don't know what can be done on a substantive level in that regard now, just because here in DC there's just a lot of concern about the economy being as uh, as well, as delicate in a position as it is now. So I don't think we should set a high expectations for some type of announcement of a new economic deal.
Mhm.
Mm.
Michael, another thing is that okay, so since he said it on the public forum, so I can quote him, with his name, Kamran Yusuf, is our friend. He said in his vlog that he was in Dubai, and a lot of American think tanks. They told him that they were surprised about this visit. So were you also surprised, or it is something very short notice, but although Wajid Ali Sayed has mentioned it long time ago that it is about to come. I mean, but how you see it, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, as I said right at the top, the timing is somewhat surprising, given that the U.S. has so many other things going on. Gaza, Ukraine, China, and of course, gearing up for the election here in the U.S. as well. So that is a bit surprising. And not only that, it's nothing surprising. I mean, you always have army chiefs coming to the U.S. That's part of the relationship. But we saw in the photo that I think ISPR posted when the army chief met with Blinken, the ISI chief was standing right there too. So we know that the ISI chief is here with the army chief. This sometimes happens, but that's also significant. You have essentially the two most powerful leaders in Pakistan that are here in the U.S. spending time here. Why now when the U.S. is focused on so many other things? So yeah, I think it is a surprise. But again, I go back to what I said before, that there is a legacy of strong officer-to-officer relations between the U.S. and Pakistan. And Munir, as you know, has met twice with the CENTCOM chief since he became army chief. It's just over a year. He's met him twice, both times in Pakistan. So I would think, if anything, it would make sense for the military, the U.S. military, to want to meet with him. But the fact that he's getting all these meetings with so many officials at the State Department, and of course the Deputy National Security Advisor, he met with the UN Secretary General. I do think that he's going to end up at CENTCOM at some point if he's not already there. One would think he would have to meet with General Kurilla. But yeah, it is a bit surprising because of the timing. I'll say that. And final word, I'll note on that. If you look at what are the big issues that U.S. officials are thinking about the most now, China, Ukraine, Gaza. Um, I said before that Gaza, Ukraine don't really relate to Pakistan in a direct way, which is true. But if you think a bit more deeply, there have been multiple reports indicating that Pakistan has provided arms to the Ukrainian military. I don't know. I mean, Islamabad keeps rejecting those reports, but I don't see why that wouldn't be true. Maybe that's something that would be that the U.S. would want to talk to Munir about. Gaza, of course, Pakistan is fully behind the Palestinians, but the Pakistanis and Munir specifically have very close ties with the Gulf states, with the Arab Gulf states, and those are critical players in the diplomacy that's going on. The U.S. is trying to conduct vis-a-vis the war. As for China, very notable that we're hearing military officials in Pakistan in recent months talk about basically signaling that they don't want the U.S. to think that Pakistan is in China's camp, and that there's a desire to balance relations between the U.S. Between China and the U.S. And we heard Hina Rabbani Carr make a comment to this effect some months ago as well in the previous government. So maybe the U.S. was curious to hear Pakistan's position on the China factor, and especially from the person that calls the shots on these foreign policy issues in Pakistan. So those could be some additional reasons why the U.S. would want to invite him here now.
Okay. Ms. I don't have any further questions, but
no, actually, I have some specific questions. If you allow me, Faraz,
yes,
I can
please.
put it to Michael. Michael, you know Dr. Kamran Bukhari. He is our friend. So he said a couple of times in my show that the strategy to tackle the terrorism is one of the ways that Pakistan should do some short military operation and take over some buffer zone, just like Israel did to avoid the attacks from Syria, taking over the Golan Heights. So, do you think anything of that form is going on higher level? Of course, Kamran's was giving ideas, but do you see anything like that? Any talk about this kind of issue like
And
that? Because
if Pakistan were to
terrorism,
do that, I
terrorism
think
is
that
turning a very, very
yeah,
difficult
and
problem for
I think
Pakistan.
if Pakistan were to do that in Afghanistan, do you think US will support?
US would support anything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, great questions, and of course, I have great respect for Kamran. So, I mean, for several things to look at here. First of all, I have not heard, I'm not privy to any conversations about this. So I don't know if this scenario of Pakistani operations in Afghanistan or to target terrorism, if those have been discussed during General Munir's visit or in any other U.S.-Pakistan context. But several things here. First of all, there is a precedent, right? I mean, we know that in the past, the Pakistani military has staged operations in Afghanistan to target terrorists, not in the Taliban era, or not in the current Taliban era, but it has happened in the past. Two, you look at how things are playing out, and it's the military and the police that are getting hit hard the most by terrorism. Civilians are still getting targeted for sure, but most of these attacks are against the military, including military facilities and bases, such as the one in KPK just the other day. So I think there's a lot of pressure on the army and on Munir to deal something with the problem. And there's no strategy. There's clearly no strategy at all. It's all very ad hoc at this point. Talks clearly don't work, and maybe the Pakistanis would hope that they could try to resume talks with the TTP with Taliban mediation. But the TTP, they wouldn't, they've never talks with the TTP have never worked, and I imagine they would insist on the same demands that Pakistan has felt are wholly unrealistic. One being for the army to get out of North Waziristan, the other to allow Sharia to be imposed. The TTP essentially would like to negotiate a situation where they could actually take over North Waziristan. That's pretty much what they're looking to do in potential negotiations. So that leaves the issue of kinetic activities. Um, I think that it cannot be ruled out. I think it's certainly not something that Pakistan would want to do, especially with the political turmoil, with the economic crisis, and of course with the very troubled relations with the Taliban at this point. But it sort of raises some interesting questions in that if the Pakistanis were to try to launch some type of operation in Afghanistan to deal with terrorism problems, the conventional wisdom is that the Taliban would reject that. They would perhaps even respond militarily, and that you could have the risk of a limited war between the Pakistanis and the Taliban, which is so ironic given how this relationship was for so many years. But here's the issue, and then I'll end here. The Taliban have long denied that their territory is used by groups that pose threats to Pakistan or any other state. So if Pakistan were to launch these operations and the Taliban were to react publicly and reject what Pakistan is doing, and also if they were to respond militarily, that would basically show that they've been lying all along, that there's no issue, that you don't have the actors in Afghanistan that pose threats to the Pakistanis or others. So that's a tricky thing for the Taliban to navigate. But
But
bottom line, I don't think we can rule out the possibility of those types of operations. I think that the Pakistanis would want to keep them covert. They wouldn't want to make a big deal out of them. They would not want to announce them. But of course, the question is how the Taliban react and so on. I think that we've seen that the fencing, the fact that much of the Durand line was fenced in recent years, that has not helped. That has not stopped terrorists from entering Pakistan. Fortifying border security more broadly, that hasn't helped either. So really, Pakistan has very few options at this point for how to deal with this threat, which is why we can't rule out that option that you mentioned.
but Michael, the Afghan Taliban have really stood behind the TTP. It's pretty obvious, right? They are not willing to conduct any operations against TTP inside Afghanistan.
Mhm.
Basically, TTP has a freedom, complete freedom in Afghanistan, right, where they're operating from. So Pakistan looks like has a all right to go conduct operation inside Afghanistan. But the question really becomes, if those were to happen, what will be the U.S. reaction?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. And right, I know that it was mentioned before. It's hard to say. I think that the U.S. would want to stay as quiet as it could. It would not want to react publicly. And I think that let's keep in mind that if Pakistan did this, if they went into Afghanistan and staged operations, it's something that would not be received well by the Taliban. It would also obviously it would embolden the TTP in a big way because they would be the target. And if the U.S. were seen as backing these types of Pakistani operations, I think that could put the U.S. back in the crosshairs of the TTP. So I think that's the last thing that the U.S. wants now, right? I mean, they don't want their nationals, their interests in Pakistan facing
But
new threats of TTP.
yeah, Michael, sorry for interruption, but TTP has had the history of attacking US officials in Afghanistan and both in Pakistan as well. So there is a history there of TTP attacking US officials. I mean, they killed the CIA rep in Afghanistan, and so that was actually there was a movie made on that as well. So I mean, I think TTP is a threat not just to Pakistan but to US.
Right. So you're right. Indeed, in the past, TTP have targeted the Americans, and the Marriott hotel bombing and other
Mm.
things too that target Americans. But TTP is a different entity than it used to be. Or here in Washington, it's perceived as a different entity. It's perceived as a terror group that's no longer targeting or even threatening the
Mm.
U.S. It's perceived as a group that's almost
Okay.
exclusively targeting Pakistanis as well as Chinese. And we know that the Chinese are getting targeted, but that's because they're working openly with Pakistan on infrastructure. So I do think that the U.S. doesn't want to do anything that could risk bringing the TTP back to a situation where it would want to target the Americans again. So I think that the U.S. certainly backs Pakistan's efforts to address terrorism, including TTP terrorism. So I don't see why the U.S. would oppose steps that Pakistan would want to take to do exactly
Okay.
that. But it is complicated because the U.S. has its own um, access to the Taliban. It is, I think, depending on the Taliban to target ISK. The U.S. it's trying to ensure a workable enough relationship with the Taliban so that it can try to negotiate with them to prevent humanitarian aid from getting caught up. So for all these reasons, if the U.S. is seen as backing a Pakistani military operation in Afghanistan, that's not going to help the U.S. cause
Okay.
with the Taliban, quite frankly. So
Okay.
my sense
Okay.
is maybe
Uh,
there'd be some
yeah,
silent support, but not
Michael,
much else.
yeah, just a short question here. See, the thing is that I agree with you that like TTP doesn't have yet the global reach, so of course it cannot attack U.S. interests directly. So are the Al Qaeda's. They did not have initially the global reach, but they get the global reach, and they pulled the 9/11 type of terrorist attack. So don't you think that US lawmaker doesn't think about it that in the future, I mean, if they grow up, they keep on winning all the things, they can grow, right? I mean, and they can reach there. So do you think that anything like that is the mind of
Maybe,
the
yeah.
US
Yeah.
policymakers?
Uh, no, absolutely, and I don't. The last thing I would want to do is to suggest to you or your audience that I think that we should be complacent about terrorist threats. Indeed, I mean the TTP it has a track record of doing horrible things against Americans, and just
Yeah.
because they claim rhetorically that they're not targeting Americans doesn't mean that they won't in the future. There is the legacy that you mentioned. Of course, you had a TTP trained guy that tried to blow up Times Square some years ago. So
Yes.
yeah, so yeah,
Shazam. Yeah.
right. So you absolutely, yeah, you're right. I mean, I can't predict how TTP might evolve, but at this point in time, it appears that it is not targeting the U.S. And I
Okay.
think there had been, you may remember this some months ago, there had been a reports that the TTP was threatening again to attack the Marriott Hotel in Islamabad, which of
Yeah.
course is a place where Americans are. The TTP rejected that right after those reports came out, which is very interesting. Yeah. Now, again, TTP is aligned with other actors that I think would want to target Americans. And if you look at the likes of Jamaat ul-Ahrar, which may
Okay.
be a faction of the TTP, might be a bit separate from it, they're much more hardline and
Okay.
hardcore. So yeah, I agree with you that maybe the U.S. should be a bit more willing to look at the TTP as a bigger threat to itself. But at this point in time, at this very delicate point in time, the U.S. looks at TTP as a group that doesn't bother it or doesn't threaten it. And given everything else that the U.S. has going on now, the
Not
last
a
thing we
priority.
have to worry about is a new threat to its
Yeah.
security, in Pakistan or wherever may be the
Yeah.
case.
And I think we're somewhat running out of time, but how do you see the return of Afghan refugees? How does US see this? And I think there has been some claim that US is not very happy about Pakistan forcing the Afghan refugees to return to their country.
Right. I mean, I think that Pakistan's response to this, which I could acknowledge, which I could sympathize with, is that, well, I mean, the U.S. has taken so much time to process these special immigration visas that, it's not Pakistan's fault that 2 years after the Taliban takeover, you have these Afghans that are still stuck and haven't been able to come to the U.S. But let's be very clear. I think that if you look at humanitarian law, among other things, it's not right. It's not legal for for individuals to be forcibly sent back to a country where they face threats to their lives. It's the doctrine of non-refoulement, I think it's called. So there's that. Yes, the U.S. is very concerned, and we've seen that much of the high-level diplomacy between the U.S. and Pakistan in recent days has revolved around this issue. Tom West, as you know, was recently in Pakistan. He discussed this issue. You had another senior official from the State Department who focuses on rights and refugee issues. She was there discussing this. So this is a priority, and I think that the U.S. is somewhat reassured, and that there's been some pretty substantive discussions between the U.S. and Pakistan on making sure that you don't have that nightmare scenario of thousands of Afghans, SIV candidates, being sent back to Afghanistan. And I would think that the Pakistanis, including General Munir, who have a strong interest in making the relationship work with the U.S., at this point in time, wouldn't want to risk upsetting America by just saying, forget it, we don't care. It's your own fault for not acting more quickly to bring them into the U.S. They're going back to Afghanistan. I don't think that that will happen. But yeah, as I said before, I think that one of the biggest agenda points for many of the U.S. officials meeting with Munir is this issue of the Afghan refugee policy.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Michael, thank you so much for joining. It was great having you on the call on our show. Audience, we हमने discussed किया, as you could see, we discussed the U.S.-Pakistan relations. There are, it looks like Pakistan has significant challenges which Pakistan may need the support of U.S. But as Michael suggested, Pakistan is still relevant. The rumors of Pakistan not being relevant as have been turned down. But anyway, until next week, give us your feedback, give us your inputs. Until then, goodbye.